I want to start with the quiet. Not the quiet before my daughter said it. Not the quiet after the judge asked his question. I want to start with the quiet that sat in between those two things. 4 seconds between my own daughter standing up in a courtroom and calling me a man who never built anything real, and a judge slowly setting down a folder and asking her lawyer if he'd actually read what was inside it. 4 seconds. I have replayed those 4 seconds more times than I've replayed anything else in my life. Because in those 4 seconds I didn't move. I didn't reach for my water. I didn't look at my daughter, or at her lawyer, or at the row of families sitting behind her who'd flown in just to watch this happen to me. I looked at the judge, and the judge looked at me, and something passed between the two of us that I still can't fully name, except to say it was the look of one man recognizing another not as a stranger, not as a name on a docket, but as somebody who'd actually done something with his life and had just been handed proof of it by somebody who understood exactly what that proof meant. 4 seconds. Then the judge picked the folder back up, opened it to the first tab, and said, "Counsel, has your client actually looked through what her father built?" And my daughter's attorney, a sharp young man who'd been so certain walking in, went pale and started flipping pages like he was looking for an exit that wasn't there. Folks, if you're new here, welcome to Old Man's Reckoning. Pull up a chair, because this one starts in a courtroom, and it ends in a courtroom. And everything in the middle is the story of a man who spent 30 years building something nobody around him bothered to look at twice, while the person who shared his blood stood up in front of a judge and called it nothing. She used that word, nothing. Go on and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell if you're not already family here, because what was sitting in that folder and what the judge said after he read it is not the kind of thing that happens by luck. It happens when a man gets underestimated for 3 decades straight and finally lets the record speak for him. Stick with me, friend. We're going somewhere. My name is Walter Briggs. I'm 67 years old, and I've spent most of my life on a piece of land outside a small town in eastern Tennessee that I built with my own 2 hands, starting back when I was 34 and had nothing but a pickup truck, a welding torch, and a stubborn streak my own daddy used to say would either make me rich or get me killed. Turned out to be a little of both, depending on who you ask. I'm not a scientist. I never went to college a day in my life. What I am is a machinist and a inventor, self-taught, and I hold, as of the morning I'm fixing to tell you about, 22 patents. Not applications. Not ideas scribbled on a napkin. 22 actual patents, registered proper with the United States government. Most of them in agricultural equipment, things that make a combine run smoother, a irrigation system waste less water, a grain auger clear a jam, without a man losing a finger to it. I'm telling you this not to brag on myself. I'm telling you this because my own daughter stood up in a federal courtroom and told a judge that I never built anything real in my whole life. And I need you to sit with the full weight of what she said, because she knew about every one of those patents. She'd been in the kitchen the night I got the first one, back in 1994, when I came in from the shop at near midnight and told her mother the application had gone through, and her mother had looked up from folding laundry and asked if that meant I'd finally quit smelling like a shop rag at supper. My daughter was 12 years old, sitting right there at that table, and she heard the whole thing. She knew about all 22. Let me tell you about Denise. Denise Briggs, my only child, born in 1982, the smartest one in any room she ever walked into, and she knew it from about the age of 6. I raised her mostly on my own after her mother passed when Denise was 16 cancer. Quick and cruel, the kind that doesn't give a family time to brace for it. Denise went off to a university 2 states away on a scholarship she earned fair and square, and she never looked back at the farm. Not really, not the way you look back at a place that made you. She became a good attorney herself, a good one, corporate law, the kind that wears suits that cost more than my truck and flies first class like it's nothing. I was proud of her. I want to say that plain, right up front, because everything that follows is going to sound like I wasn't, and that's not true. I was proud of my daughter. I just don't think she was ever proud of me. Not once she got old enough to measure a man by the kind of things they measure men by in the rooms she started running in. The trouble, if you want to call it that, started slow. The way a crack in a foundation starts slow. It wasn't one thing. It was 30 years of small things stacking up like cordwood. When I got my 3rd patent in 1998, an improvement on a harrow disc that cut down on soil compaction, Denise was home from college for the summer and I told her about it at supper. She asked me how much money it made. I told her the licensing fee was modest, a few thousand a year, from one implement company out of Iowa. She said, "That's it?" and went back to her phone. That was 1998. By 2005, I had 9 patents and a small but steady stream of royalty checks that I didn't spend, because I never did learn how to spend money the way people who grew up comfortable spend it. I put it away, careful, the same way I did everything, measure twice, cut once, same in the bank as in the shop. By 2012, I had 15 patents, and one of them, a self-clearing mechanism for grain augers, had gotten picked up by one of the 2 biggest equipment manufacturers in the country. The royalty structure on that one was tied to units sold, and once that auger attachment started shipping on new combines nationwide in 2014, the numbers on my quarterly statement stopped looking like a farmer's numbers and started looking like something else entirely. I called Denise that spring, told her what the statement showed. She went quiet on the phone a second. Then she said, "Wait, Dad, is that number real?" I said it was. She said, "From one part?" I said, "From one licensing deal, on one patent." "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet again, longer this time, and then she said something I want to tell you word for word, because it's the sentence that made me understand, clear as glass, what the last 18 years between us had actually been. She said, "Well, I guess it was worth all those years of you smelling like diesel after all. Worth it." I sat there holding that phone and I thought about every school function I'd shown up to straight from the shop because I couldn't afford to close it down early, and the particular way she used to introduce me to her college friends. My dad, he tinkers with farm stuff, like she was managing something she was a little embarrassed to be carrying. I thought about every conversation where she'd change the subject the second I started talking about a new design, because nobody at her table understood it, and could we please talk about something else? Worth it, after all. I said, "Denise, I need to think on something." She said, "What?" I said, "Whether you and I want the same things out of this family." She got quiet in a way I hadn't heard from her before. Or maybe I had heard it before, and just never known what I was hearing. It wasn't surprise in her voice. It was the sound of somebody recalculating. I didn't know yet what she was working out in her head, but I was paying attention now in a way I hadn't let myself pay attention before, and in my experience, paying attention is where everything worth knowing gets its start. The next 2 years I need to walk you through careful, because something shifted, not all at once, but gradual, the way water finds a new path around a rock. Once the old path's been named out loud, and both people know it's been named, and neither one's sure what to do with that. Denise started calling more. She asked after the shop. She drove up for Thanksgiving 2 years running, which she hadn't done in a long stretch before that. She sat with me at the workbench one evening and let me show her the auger design, and she asked good questions, sharp ones, the kind a smart woman asks when she's actually trying to understand something for the first time. I noticed, too, because I've spent 40 years noticing small things in metal that don't sit quite true, that she also started asking different kinds of questions. About how the patents were held, about whether they were in my name alone or in some kind of trust, about what would happen to the royalty income if something happened to me. I don't react quick to early readings. I record what I'm seeing and I wait for the pattern to prove itself out, same as I would with a machine that's making a sound I don't like yet. In September of last year, Denise came to me with a proposal. Not a divorce. I want to be clear, friend. This isn't a marriage story. This is a family story. And maybe that cuts even closer for some of you listening. She came to me with what she called a family wealth restructuring plan, drawn up by a estate attorney colleague of hers, that would place my patents and the LLC. I held them through into a trust that named her as primary beneficiary, and, more to the point, as a controlling trustee while I was still living. She said it was about protecting the family's legacy. She said it was about making sure things were handled properly when the time came. And wouldn't I rather have that settled now instead of leaving a mess? I told her I'd think on it. I called my attorney that same afternoon. His name is Roy Castellano, and he'd been handling my patent business since 2001, back when I got my second one, and realized a man needs somebody smarter than him about paperwork if he's going to keep what he builds. Roy was pushing 65 himself, dry as an August riverbed, and he had exactly the one quality I valued most in any professional I ever hired. He never told me what I wanted to hear, only what was true. I told him about Denise's proposal. He was quiet a minute on the phone. Then he said, "Walter, I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer." I said, "Always." He said, "Has Denise ever contributed, in any way you could document, to the actual invention or development of any of these patents?" I thought about 30 years, about Denise in the rooms I never could navigate, about the law school and the corporate towers and the career that ran parallel to mine without ever once crossing it in a technical sense. I said, "No, she never had." Roy said, "Good. Then we know where we're standing. But Walter, I want to tell you something plain. When a family member gets a real look at what another family member's quietly built, the offer of just handling things properly has a way of turning into something with teeth. I want to tell you what happened next fast, because it did happen fast, faster than I expected. Denise didn't take my hesitation well. Within 2 months, acting through an attorney of her own, not the estate colleague, a different one, a hard-nosed litigator named Preston Vale who specialized, Roy told me, in contested guardianship and elder asset cases, she filed a petition, not for a trust, for a conservatorship. She was asking the court to find that I, at 67, was no longer competent to manage complex financial and intellectual property assets on my own, and that she should be appointed to manage them for me. The petition described me, in its own language, as a man of limited education and limited financial sophistication who had, through pure fortune, come into money he did not have the capacity to properly steward. It did not use the words, "worthless nobody." Those words came later, out loud, in a room, from her own mouth. But the petition was built on the same foundation that whatever I'd made of myself out in that shop for 30 years didn't amount to real accomplishment, and that Denise's law degree and her city sophistication made her the only one fit to hold what I'd built. I sat in Roy's office the day we got served, and I thought about that phone call, about worth it after all, and I understood now exactly what she'd been recalculating at that kitchen table 2 years before. I said, "Roy, what's our position?" He said our position was straightforward, that I was of sound mind, that the record of my professional output over 3 decades spoke for itself far louder than any petition could, and that Denise's contributions, real as they were in the ordinary sense of being a good and dutiful daughter for stretches of her life, did not amount to legal grounds for stripping a competent man of control over what his own 2 hands had made. He said it was a strong position. Then he said, "But Walter, I need to prepare you for something. When the legal argument gets hard for the other side, the human argument becomes the whole strategy. Preston Vale is going to put Denise on that stand, and she is going to tell a story about a father who was distant and difficult and out of touch with the modern world, and who needed his daughter's protection whether he wanted it or not. And that story, in front of the right judge, can move things in ways the paperwork alone can't always stop." I said, "Let her tell it." Roy looked at me careful. I said, "Let her tell every last word of it, Roy, because I've been watching this family for 30 years, and I've got my own record of what's happened in it, and it's documented clean." Roy said, "Documented how?" I said, "I mean, I'm a man who keeps a shop log, same as I keep a ledger. I've got every patent file back to 1994. I've got the notebooks with every design sketch and every failed prototype before the one that worked. I've got the correspondence with every manufacturer I ever licensed to, and the royalty statements going back 20 years, and I've got something else besides. I've got 30 years of cards and letters Denise wrote me herself, from college, from law school, from her first years practicing, every one of them telling me how proud she was of her old man and his little inventions. I never threw a single one away." Roy sat back in his chair a long moment. Then he said, "Walter, how complete is complete?" I said, 30 years complete, Roy. Now if you're still with me, and this is starting to sit heavy in your chest the way it sat in mine, I want you to do one thing right now. Go on and hit that like button, because what happened in that courtroom the morning of the hearing is something that took every bit of what I just told you to set up, and I want you to see the whole thing clear. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Then stay right here with me. We're almost to the door. The hearing was set for a Wednesday morning in March, in the county courthouse, though it had been elevated to a special probate judge given the size of the assets involved. I want to tell you what I knew walking in and what I didn't, because both matter. What I knew was that Roy had built a response as thorough as anything he'd done in 40 years of practice. He'd brought in a intellectual property specialist who'd gone through all 22 patents and confirmed sole inventorship on every one. He'd brought a forensic accountant who'd traced the royalty income back to its source and confirmed it flowed entirely from licensing agreements. I'd negotiated myself, with no contribution from Denise, financial or otherwise. He'd lined up two men who'd worked alongside me over the years, a old welding partner and a manufacturer's rep, both ready to testify to what the shop work actually looked like day to day. What I didn't know was what Denise was going to say with her own mouth, in front of that judge, with her own family sitting behind her. Roy had warned me. He said Preston Vale had spent considerable time preparing her testimony, that she was going to lay out a case that made me sound small and lost and in need of rescuing. I said, "Let her." He said, "Walter, when she's talking, I need you dead still. Whatever she says, you don't react. Look at me, or look at the judge, but you do not react." I said, "Understood." He said, "I mean it, Walter." I said, "Roy, I spent 30 years not reacting to things my own daughter said to me. I've had the practice." He almost laughed at that. First time I'd seen it out of him in 8 months. He said, "Good. Use it now." We got to the courthouse a little after 8. I wore the same brown suit I wore to my mother's funeral and to every one of my patent hearings besides. The one suit I owned that mattered. Roy had his briefcase and his files, and that particular still calm of a man who'd prepared everything preparation, allows for and was ready for whatever the morning threw at him. Preston Vale was already in the hallway when we walked up. Sharp suit, sharper watch, and he gave me the kind of look a man gives something he's already decided he understands completely. The hearing opened at 9. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Ruth Alvarez, 62 years old, on the probate bench a long while, known, Roy told me, for patience and for reading every page of every file herself instead of relying on summaries. What Roy didn't know, and what none of us knew walking in, was that Judge Alvarez had grown up on a working farm in the same county, and before law school had spent 2 years as an agricultural extension agent, going property to property, helping small farmers with exactly the kind of mechanical problems I'd spent my whole life solving. I didn't know that walking in either. Nobody did, except maybe God. Preston Vale opened strong, and I'll give the man his due. He was good at what he does. He painted a picture of an aging man, alone since his wife passed, unsophisticated, isolated out on a rural property, sitting on assets that had grown far beyond his capacity to understand or manage, and a devoted daughter who'd tried every reasonable route to help before finally, reluctantly, coming to the court as a last resort. He used the phrase limited capacity more than once. He used the word protection. He was smooth. Roy's response was patient and stacked with documents. The IP specialist's findings, the accountant's trace of the money, the testimony of men who'd stood beside me at a workbench for 20 years. He was building the true picture careful, the way you build anything meant to hold weight. Then Preston Vale called Denise to the stand. She was composed, same as she always was in a room, dressed clean and careful, and she answered the early questions with the polish of somebody who'd prepared thorough. She described things accurately enough on the surface, the late nights in the shop, the missed events, the way I never could talk about anything at a dinner party except whatever I was building. None of that was a lie. The lie was in what those true things were made to mean. And then Preston Vale asked her a question built to get one particular answer, and Denise gave it to him with a conviction I could tell she genuinely felt in that moment. He said, "Miss Briggs, in your own words, describe your father's capacity to manage his own affairs." And Denise looked out at the courtroom, at the family behind her, at Preston Vale. She did not look at me. She said, "Your Honor, my father never built anything real in his life. He spent 30 years in a metal shed while the rest of the world moved forward without him. Whatever money came his way was luck, not skill, and he does not have the understanding to manage what he has." The room went still. I looked at the judge. The judge looked at me, and that's when I saw it. The recognition I told you about at the start of all this, because Judge Ruth Alvarez, who'd walked 100 farms as a young extension agent before she ever put on a robe, was looking at the man in front of her with the face of somebody who'd just seen something that didn't match one single word of the description she'd been handed. She set her pen down. She looked at Preston Vale. She said, "Counsel, has your client actually looked through what her father built?" Preston Vale said, "Your Honor, Mr. Briggs is the respondent in this matter." She said, "I'm aware of his role in this proceeding, counsel. I'm asking whether you've reviewed the actual public record of his professional work." Preston Vale reached for his laptop. He opened it. He started typing, and I watched his hands. They started shaking before he'd finished reading the first page. "I want to slow down here, friend, because this is the part everything before it was building toward, and I want to tell it to you exact." Judge Alvarez said, "Counsel, I'm going to take a 20-minute recess. I'd like you to use that time to review the complete patent record of the respondent. When we resume, I'll have some questions of my own." She left the bench. Preston Vale closed his laptop slow. He looked over at Denise, and something crossed his face. I hadn't seen on a lawyer before the look of a man realizing the whole foundation of his case had just cracked open under his boots, and it was cracking in a way that was about to be visible to everybody in that room. Denise said, "Quiet." "What is it?" Preston Vale said, just as quiet. "We need to talk. Now." I sat next to Roy at our table, and Roy leaned in and said, "Walter, what just happened?" I said, "Judge Alvarez grew up on a farm. You told me that yourself, back when we picked our filings." Roy said, "I mentioned it in passing." I said, "I don't let much pass me by, Roy." He looked at me a long second, the same look he'd give a weld he wasn't sure would hold, then decided it would. He said, "What does she know, specifically?" I said, "The grain auger patent. It got written up in a agricultural equipment trade journal back in 2015, the kind extension agents and equipment engineers actually read. If she kept any connection to that world after she went to law, she'll know the design. She may well know my name," Roy said. "And the other 21. I said, "All public record, Roy, everyone. The licensing agreements are public. The manufacturer partnerships got covered in farm trade press over the years. Anybody who knew where to look could have found every bit of it before they ever filed a petition calling me incapable," Roy said. "Which a attorney building an incapacity case against you should have looked for." I said, "You'd think." Roy looked over at Preston Vale, who was now in what looked like a real tense, real quiet conversation with my daughter. Roy said, "He built this whole case on the word of a woman who called her own father worthless in open court." I said, "He did." Roy said, "And he never once checked what you'd actually built." I said, "Looks that way." The recess ran near 30 minutes, longer than the 20 she'd promised, and I took that as a sign somebody in that back room was doing some hard reading. When Judge Alvarez came back to the bench, she had a legal pad in front of her, with several pages of her own handwriting on it. She settled in. She looked at Preston Vale. She said, "Counsel, have you completed your review?" He said, "Yes, Your Honor." And then he sat quiet, a beat longer than any courtroom silence ought to run comfortable. He said, "Your Honor, I'd like to request a continuance to allow both parties to revisit the evidentiary basis of this petition." Judge Alvarez said, "I imagine you would." Request denied. She set her pen down careful. She said, "Mr. Vale, I have sat on this bench a long while, and before that I spent 2 years walking farm properties in this very county as a extension agent, helping men not so different from Mr. Briggs solve mechanical problems that mattered to their livelihood and, frankly, to a good many other livelihoods across this country. I want to be precise about something this morning," she said. "The characterization your petition offers of the respondent as a man of limited capacity is flatly inconsistent with a public record showing 22 granted United States patents, active licensing agreements with 2 of the largest agricultural equipment manufacturers in this country, royalty income that this court does not see in most estate matters of any size, and a specific innovation in grain auger safety that has been credited, in the trade literature I happen to still read out of old habit, with preventing a significant number of injuries on farms across this country since it entered the market." She paused. She said, "I am familiar with that publication, counsel. I read it for years before law school, and I have continued to read it since, because old habits from a life on a farm do not leave a person just because they put on a robe." The courtroom sat dead still. She said, "I am not suggesting a family cannot have legitimate concerns worth this court's attention. That is precisely what these proceedings exist for. What I am suggesting is that the evidentiary foundation offered here, specifically the characterization of Mr. Briggs's capacity and his life's work, requires a full and honest recalibration before this court can proceed one step further. She looked at Denise. She said, "Miss Briggs, I am going to give you the opportunity to reconsider the testimony you gave this morning. In light of the complete professional record of your father, which apparently you had not reviewed before offering that testimony under oath, you have that right, and I'd encourage you to take it seriously." Denise's face did something I hadn't seen it do in 35 years of knowing her. Every bit of that composure left her all at once, not into anger, but into the particular look of somebody who's built a whole argument on a foundation and just been shown, plain and public, that the foundation was never what she believed it to be. She looked at Preston Vale. He didn't look back at her. And then, for the first time all morning, she looked at me. I looked back at her, and I thought about that kitchen table, about a phone call 2 years back, about worth it after all. I didn't say a single word. I just looked at her steady until she was the one who looked away. What happened over the following month I want to tell you accurate, because the ending matters as much as that moment did. Preston Vale withdrew the conservatorship petition entirely within the week. Before the court could even schedule a formal ruling against him, Roy said that was as close to a full retreat as he'd seen in this line of work. The forensic accountant's report, once it got fully entered into the record, put to rest any question about where the money came from and whose hands had built it. Denise, through her attorney, tried once to negotiate some kind of ongoing advisory role in managing the trust that held my patents. Roy and I both said no, not out of spite. Out of the plain fact that a man who built a thing with his own 2 hands, over 30 years, alone in a shop at midnight while everybody else in his life was somewhere warmer and easier, gets to say what happens to it. I moved nothing, changed nothing, kept the same shop and the same land and the same routine I'd kept for 3 decades. But I sat out on my porch the evening after the settlement got finalized, coffee gone cold in my hand, and I thought a long while about what had been settled and what hadn't. Some things don't settle in a month or a year. What settles, slow and imperfect, is the understanding of how 2 people who share the same blood can spend 30 years under different roofs building entirely different pictures of what the other one's life amounted to. Denise wasn't lying about what she saw. She was limited by what she'd let herself look at. She measured a life by degrees and titles and the kind of rooms a person gets invited into. And out in my shop, with grease under my nails and a torch in my hand, I was near invisible to that particular measure. That wasn't cruelty in her, not exactly. It was a failure of looking, and it was a failure I'd had some hand in myself, for never finding a way to make what I did make sense to the one person I most wanted to understand it. I want to say something plain to you before I let you go tonight. If you've ever built something real with your own hands or your own mind, and the people closest to you looked right past it, I want you to hear this. The fact that they couldn't see it is not proof it wasn't there. It's only proof of the distance between the way you understand a life and the way they do. My 22 patents are real. The auger guard that's kept God knows how many hands whole on farms across this country is real. The men who've called me over the years to thank me for a piece of machinery that let them work another 20 years without losing a finger to it, that's real too. None of it needed Denise to see it in order to be real. What it needed, to be seen, was a courtroom, and a judge who'd once walked farms herself, and a morning where the gap between the story my daughter had been telling about me and the plain record of what I'd actually done became visible to every soul in that room at the same time. That wasn't revenge, and I want to be clear about that with you tonight. I took no joy watching my daughter's face when that judge read the patent list out loud. I took no joy in Preston Vale's hands shaking over that laptop. Those weren't victories to me. They were corrections, a record set right after sitting wrong a long while. If there's revenge in any of this, it's the 22 patents themselves. It's 30 years in a shop, solving problems that mattered to people I'll never meet. It's the life I built regardless of whether the one person across my own kitchen table ever learned to see the worth in it. That's the only kind of revenge that holds up over time, friend. If this one meant something to you tonight, go on and share it with somebody who needs to hear it. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and leave me a word down in the comments. Tell me about something you built with your own 2 hands that the people closest to you never once looked at twice. I read every single one. I'll see you next time, family.